Hello. Thank you. I'm Ivan. I actually studied architecture. I had nothing to do with games before, like 6 years ago. Yeah, I actually started by modding racing games. So I just made 3D models. I didn't know how to program at the time, so these are some of the stuff I made. Yeah, but whole life I played handmade games. Like all the games I played didn't have any or very little procedural generation, more like random events, right? But on the first game jam I went to, the time I didn't really know how to program much. A friend of mine just I made this asteroid model, and he just spawned a bunch of asteroids, and I was like, hey, did you like drop them in the scene? And he was like, no, I just like this is the thing, right? I mean it's in Unity, so it's like you just instantiates 1,000 asteroids, and I was like, whoa, you can do that. I had no idea that it's so easy to make stuff procedurally, and I was just wondering, like, why don't all games do that? Why do you hire like 50 artists for games and not program everything? Because I studied architecture, I learned that you need to invest this hard work, doing something, some repetitive work all the time. It was like, yeah, you can actually like look at the patterns and use these patterns to program and make 3D stuff. So yeah, that's when I was totally hooked. And one more important thing is that I'm not from Finland. So I'm actually from Serbia. I just hijacked the Finnish, basically culturally appropriating them. So once I was hooked to a procedure generation, I started making procedurally generated games. So one of the first ones I made is the Library of Blabber, which is like an infinite library with infinite books, and you can take any and read, and it's just gibberish basically, but it's fun. And I wrote a few algorithms for like different types of books. One of them is Norman's Sky, which came out, I actually made this one in like 10 hours and came out a few months before No Man's Sky, and everybody loved it because it's basically the same thing. It's like green planet, yellow sky, red planet, blue sky, right? It's the same thing. One more thing I published last year is Trails of Tenere, which is like an endless. Oh yeah, so endless is something that I'm really interested in. That's like my thing, right? So this is basically like, if you know Paris-Dakar rally, it's kind of inspired by the early rallies where you just are lost in the desert and you try to find a way out, and you ride a motorbike in an endless desert. So yeah, pretty cool. Also, yeah, you make trails. That's why it's called the Trails of Tenere. And the trails you make are shared with other players. So I just send the trails to the server, and then in the description of the game I say follow the trails, but actually, there's no goal actually, because all the other trails are made by other people. I don't think that. The thing is that because I described it like that, I don't think many people got the point. A few people contacted me and said like, oh wow, this is such a good idea, but 99% of the people were like, what is this? But it's fine. One more project I worked on, which I'm still kind of working on and off, is the Thought of Train, which is like just endless, enjoying the view from the train thing. And one thing that I actually worked on in a company, you can say, is on Derail Valley, which is a VR train simulator, a more realistic one this time. And yeah, there I made procedural generations for tracks and tools for generating tracks, and also worked on physics. So yeah, physics is one other thing I really like. So how did INFINLAND come to be? I basically was flying over Sweden once, and I looked at it and I was like, wow, this looks so procedurally generated. I mean, it's so simple. Totally. And I mean, this is Sweden, not Finland, but it's basically the same thing, right? So, okay. Yeah, I was flying over Sweden. I love rally games, like in my childhood as well. I loved playing rally games. And one day I was thinking about, I just heard somebody say like in Finland, and I thought, oh, did you say something infinite? And I'm like, oh, in Finland. Oh, wow. That's pretty cool name for a maybe game that I can do one day. I should totally do this one day for fun, maybe in 2 months or something. Yeah, right. Well, it's taking me now 1.5 years already. And the thing is, like, there's not many rally games out there, and not much innovation. Like, you just like drive on stages from point to point, and that's it. But I also always wanted to a rally game where, you know, it's more focused, like not on the top racing tier, but like amateur stuff, and like driving terrible cars with, and also the adventure aspect of rally, because it's like a you can go on a rally, and like it's a full weekend, and you have this experience of like driving through forests. I don't know. So yeah, this, if you look at some random place in Finland, I mean, this is how it looks, kind of. So you can see that it's very procedurally generated, right? You have these roads that are like network of roads, lakes, and some. I don't know what it is. It's some looks like sand, but I have no idea what the white stuff is. Whatever. So yeah, for now it's only me working on the game. It's endless, of course, just like all my other games. Procedurally generated, and it's generated in runtime. So yeah, I basically coded everything in Unity. I use Unity. You can drive for as long as you want if you're like driving a free roaming mode, and the ability to drive full rallies. Like, this is something I never saw in a game before, where you don't just drive like special stages, which are like timed things, but you can just like, oh, finish the stage, and now you have to like drive on the normal roads between stages, which is also kind of a fun, an interesting aspect of real rallies. Yeah, so it's actually more like a simulation game than an arcade. And one important thing about simulation games is that performance is really important. So if you have a frame drop, like your players are gonna hate you to death. You know, it's like if you have, you know, it's like, because everything is about control, and a lot of simulation players have also like high refresh rate screens, so they really need the performance. Yeah, so I'm using basically my laptop as a testing ground. So if it works at 60 frames per second on my laptop, it's gonna work on anything else. Yeah, VR is one thing that I'm also going to have. So again, very important, performance and modding. Yeah, and yeah, made with Unity. So why procedural? Well, I already said you can have infinite possible stages at any length. And yeah, one thing is that a lot of rallies can take, especially in the old days, where they can take like for 1,000 kilometers. Like, why not have a game where you can drive for 1,000 kilometers? I don't know, there's some people like me that would love to do that. Like, oh, just have a whole day driving in a game, like competing with other people. Okay. Yeah, so it's for me as well more enjoyable, because you don't yeah, as I said, with architecture, you create something, and then you see like, oh, I want to add something, and then you go back, and it's a very destructive workflow, right? When you don't make procedural stuff. And it's a very additive process, so more rules makes more features, right? And also easily moddable because you can modify parameters easily, and anybody could do that. So anybody can create new worlds by just modifying parameters, and no additional need for making like 3D models, but you can still make 3D models if you want. And it's kind of a cool thing to have a small build, right? It's like, oh, my game is currently, I think, 100 megabytes or something. So it's like, oh, you just share it with somebody and the whole world creates for itself, you know? It's like, wow, it's cool. So yeah, I'm going with these lo-fi graphics. Well, you will actually show some screens soon, but it's basically pixelated art style. And I think that it's like consistency in the art style is much more important than, you know, high resolution and like PBR stuff. And you know, some people said like, oh, it reminds me of like old PlayStation games, which is cool, I guess. That's not my primary point, but. And yeah, it provides you with the good performance because there's less polygons, but it also means that you can render more stuff. So that's pretty cool. And I actually have no lighting in the form of like, you know, traditional lighting. I have some hacks that to make it more lighting-like, but not traditional. And you have more control because I can, if I want exactly this green pixel to be that green on the screen, you just edit the texture and that's it. There's no like effects over it or like some physical calculations that happen and not make this green. So less time to create assets. Cheaper, I don't need to hire artists. PBR is overrated. Just wanted to put that in. Yeah, I think, I mean, when you work with PBR, you really need to make, I'm not hating on PBR, I think it's great, but like you need to have exact values for everything. If you don't have that, then it's like, you know, you make a mess. Like one tree looks green, one is like bluish or something. So yeah, but it's also there's a big challenge for like if you want to render foliage really well in PBR. There's it's like yeah, PBR is really good with like surface rendering stuff, but when you need to render something that has a lot of layers of like overlapping stuff, it's yeah, it's more complicated. Anyway, yeah, so. Screen stability is this term that I use for like you know, like when you move your view in the game, it needs to look exactly the same as it did in your previous view, right? And modern games just kind of don't care about that anymore. Yeah, they use like well, screen space is like ambient occlusion, which like you know, you depend on everything that's on the screen but not off the screen. If you understand what I mean. So yeah, and also temporal effects, you know, like you turn around and you see the entire world being the lighting being generated. I'm not a big fan of that. So, and also for a racing game, that's important because things move very fast. There's a permanent overcast in the game, but just because I kind of like this art style. Okay. So yeah, the goal is to create a landscape with roads. It's Finland, so there's a lot of roads, forests and lakes, but no mountains, which is great. A lot of mountains are complicated, and everything is generated runtime. Yeah, make sure that everything, that you can always go to some other part of the world and it just gets generated, so you don't depend on the neighboring areas too much. Yeah, that it runs smooth, it's important. Avoid garbage collect, that's like, you know, you just pull everything and then reuse, basically have fixed memory. Yeah, because it creates spikes. If you code in Unity, of course, if you create your own engine or something, that might not be the case, but and yeah, pull all the things. Okay, so yeah. So some endless concepts that is important to mention are these three things. So I'm going to explain a bit. So the address random chain is a thing where you kind of have a unique property of an item, which defines the seed, which then you can create a random the chain of random values that will define this object, let's say. Yeah, I'm gonna skip a bit because there's a lot more to cover. So in the library of Blabber, for example, I use the address chain to create this, the random chain to create the text, you know, from just create a seed. And I'm actually using a hash code from a string, which is not something that you should use because it creates garbage. But back in the day when I was making this, I didn't really care about that. In Norman Sky, I generate systems like this. You take one star and you generate more planets. Yeah, with the same chaining property. And in Norman Sky as well, I have these coordinates that, but I use simplex noise for visibility, for example, where I put, because it's nice to have these groups of systems. Okay. One more thing is origin shifting. Of course, you need to, if you want to create something endless, you need to kind of, precision is the problem, right? So you can't go too far. You have to get everything back to the origin and then regenerate. So in Library of Blabber, because the whole world is exactly the same, it just moved the player back. So that's, and it looks totally infinite. Instead of train, I move the train back. I move the world back after a while, and then I basically add more tiles at the end, right? So I take the tiles from the back to the front and regenerate with a new. So yeah, why do you need to use it? It's a hack. It is because yeah, you can't, if you do it at runtime like all the time transforms, it's expensive. And most physics engines are designed to work well with static geometry, so better to do it once because you cache ABB trees and stuff. And the other is the thing that I use a lot is perturbed grid. You probably know about it if you ever did procedure generated. Some people call it jittered. Each cell has, so yeah, there's, oh, maybe you don't see it there, but there are like cells, regular cells, but position of every point is random. So also the cool thing is that you can create infinite stuff like this because every coordinate is an address, so you can create infinite things. Anyway, yeah, so there's another term that I use that I have no idea if anybody else uses, sampleability. I think it's what Simons was talking when he showed that formula. So of the what was it, the herringbone thing. That's basically something I would say it's highly sampleable because for every point you can get exact value of the function. So you can say like a sine wave is an example of highly sampleable function, right? You can take an x of any value and get a y. But some things are less sampleable. If you, okay, reading from a height map is kind of, but you need to, it's a more expensive thing. Voronoi cells, for example, they depend on neighbors, so they're less sampleable. Some things are unsampleable, like erosion, because you need to have a bounding volume to calculate erosion. Like you would need to do it offline. So yeah, oh, I totally forgot. I have so many things to say. Yeah, so basically there's two approaches to creating landscapes. One is terrain first. Which is something that the Blue Byte people are doing, for example, where you create the terrain and then you put roads on top of the terrain, right? Yeah, so anyway, I'm just going to skip this. You can read it. The approach that I'm taking is the road first approach. So I generated a layout, the network of the roads first, and then I basically fill in all the gaps with all the holes where there are no roads with terrain. Yeah, so it's easier to make endless and more control over how roads exactly look, which is very important for simulation games. And would take less time to implement, I think so. So if you look at real rallies, you have this network of roads, and then sometimes they reuse roads and not others. And the next year they can come back to the same area but use different roads. So players could like remember the same kind of roads, but then it's yeah, it could be an interesting challenge. So the first kind of version to create a road network is to use just the perturbed grid and then connect these with roads. Very simple, but yeah, it's very simple to make, but you always have like 4 links, which is kind of boring and predictable, right? You always know that there's going to be look the same. But the cool thing is that you can make it very easily infinite, right? And this is, I just wrote this in a few hours, and it just works. Okay. But I said like it's too boring, so let's try to use a Voronoi diagram. So instead of using use vertices of the Voronoi diagram as junctions for the roads. So the grid points of the perturbed grid are now the center of regions. A good thing is less predictable, more organic. The cons distances are not easily controlled. There can be very close junctions. We don't know the exact coordinates of the junctions themselves. We know where the regions are, but junctions are a bit harder to get, which I'll say later. And the Voronoi needs a bounded region. So how do you create something that's infinite but uses a Voronoi field? So yeah, this is a typical like how a Voronoi field looks. I mean, I'm just running this at every frame, but you can see that it's like a bounded region, and then you can the outermost cells are just going to like be clipped by the bounds. So the solution is just make a big diagram and pick the middle part, right? So that's one fix. Just make a bigger diagram and pick the middle. And the close by junction problem can be solved by just merging closest vertices, right? But then you have potentially even more problems, which is something that I haven't yet seen the problems, but I need to write some tests to check that. Okay, and I said just because it took a long time to implement those two hacks. So yeah, in the end you get this. So basically you can move the entire world. So you have new Voronoi regions, new tiles, and this thing with the region that is in red is basically the forward part. So when I move to a new region, I create those new tiles. So here I'm going up, now I'm going to go left, and yeah, you can see that it's repeating, I hope. So serialization, I don't want to go there. Maybe you can read it if I share the slides. Anyway. Yeah, so roads, basically I can just take one piece of road and create it like, just bend it a bit with the Pearly noise. So yeah, that kind of works really good, even though you just like, oh, it's Pearly noise, it's too simple, but actually it's pretty cool. And so basically I have 3 things. One is roads, the fields, which are the region between the roads. And there are meshes between roads. So I walk through every road and just pick the bounding points, and I do Delanoid triangulation. So I create the bounded mesh. And the junction basically uses the points of the end roads to create this specific mesh that I coded. So in the end, this is what you get. So this is how the world is generated. You create all the meshes, and basically when you move to the next tile, I create more. And then I just take those old tiles and move them forward, right? And you see, it just looks exactly like Finland. So for foliage, I wrote a lot of iterations. So yeah, I have these layers. I think that's kind of a typical thing for a foliage, so I don't want to go in too much. I just calculate visibility with Pearly noise. You can modify these parameters. Positions of each point is a perturbed grid, and I think that like Poisson disk sampling is overrated because I really don't see the difference between like a perturbed grid and I don't think any player will ever see it. So And I mean, the thing is, I can't even use it because I have this endless generation and I need to do it fast. So it's easy to add new types into the system if a modder wants to add them. For example, creates a 3D model of a tree and just adds new rules for the visibility and things. Okay, so yeah, so I divide layers into chunks, and I use indirect rendering to render them. So one chunk is one draw call, and I render 10,000. No, sorry. Is it? No, yeah, it's 10,000 instances per chunk. And the CPU overhead of drawing this is very little because it's indirect rendering. And I use Unity jobs to process matrices, which is a really cool new stuff with the Unity, makes everything much easier and faster. So basically I calculate visibility of each tile, basically one tree in parallel. And then at the end, I collect all the visible matrices and push it to the buffer, which is cool because Unity supports native arrays now. I just realized that I'm going too technical into like Unity stuff, and not other lecturers didn't really do it. So yeah, I'm sorry. So yeah, this is how. Yeah, I first use raycast to place foliage. How much time do I have? So.
Well, 20 minutes.
Oh, that's perfect. Okay, yeah. The first iteration proved to be very expensive with raycast, of course. I mean, and sometimes it would be incorrect. I would come back to the same place, and after going far away, I come back to the same place. The tree is not there. It's like a different tree, so that's really bad. So what I do now is I take a depth map from top down, and I sample it in the shader every position with the tree. So it's much faster. The only bad thing is that you need to render it at some point. So when I shift the terrain, I need to re-render it. Okay. So yeah, we also need to collide with trees, which is another challenge. So having everything collidable at all times is of course too expensive. Can't have like 10,000 colliders. Instead, I use just a few colliders around the player and I swap them as I go, and I just get those positions from those same matrix arrays that they had for creating foliage. So yeah, the same system can be extended to be more dynamic, like shrubs slowing down the player if you're near a shrub, for example. But yeah, this technique only works if there is one car. So if you have a different type of game where you need to simulate something like a plane crashing into a forest, right? It's not going to work because the player is here and watching a plane go through nothing because there's no colliders. So it only works because it's a rally game and I just simulate stuff around the player. So yeah, this is how it looks. I basically have these colliders around the player, and that's it. And it's really fast. So yeah, the shadows which I use, I call them large-scale shadows. Basically, it's kind of like a hacky ambient occlusion. When it's overcast, shadows are very diffused, and the forests are very like pitch black when you see them from the outside, which is something I don't see very often in games, and I really wanted to make that for INFINLAND. So what I do is I basically use the same idea for foliage rendering. I collect all the visible tree matrices and render them into quads, which just create these patches of dark blobs. And I add some blur after that to the map to make the outside trees lighter. And so the influence of this ambient occlusion falls off with height. So you have these nice things. And the thing is that everything basically samples this shadow map. So even particles, if you go through a forest, like in this case, you can see that particles get darker, which is nice. So yeah, this is like how it looks when you see it from space. For example, yeah. So waving foliage is a cool thing, right? When a car passes, it's kind of a nice thing. So what I did is there's basically 3 points that follow the car, and I basically pass these positions into the foliage shader, and I calculate. This has actually nothing to do with procedural generation, but I thought it's a really cool thing to talk about because a lot of people ask me about it. So basically there's 3 things. The pusher, as I call it, it just pushes the vertices away. The perturber, that perturbs at high frequency, and the trailer that perturbs at low frequency. And I use the red channel of vertex colors in models of trees for the influence map, so you don't want to wave the trunk, basically. So yeah, and every plant can have different inertia and drag. So it's quite a simple system. I don't use anything advanced like people usually use today, like pivot baking, and some people render these trails in a texture and then they kind of sample that. I don't do that. I think it's kind of too much for me. So yeah, this is how it kind of looks. Here on the left, you can see these 3 spheres of influence, basically. So the first one is on the car, which is the pusher, and the perturber and the trailer is the biggest one. So you can see on the right how it looks in the end. And basically, you can even make like strings or cables have the same shader. And it's really fast because it just works in the shader, right? And it looks really cool. And it definitely has the award for like the most tweetable feature of the game. I just put these tweets and they get a lot of likes and like, yeah, but like the generation of the world, it's also cool, but nobody cares about that. So in the end, we need to like schedule these shifts, which is another challenge. So when you reach a certain point, I move the world back to the origin. In the same frame, I set the offset to shaders so that you need to have these shadows because those shadows will be sampled, right? So you want to offset those shadows. And I created a new strip of fields, which you've seen. And when everything is complete, I rebake the top-down maps, and in the same frame I have to reset the offset to 0 so that the player doesn't notice any difference. And the end is just say, okay, you can now proceed to be regenerated again. So yeah, this is like a really early kind of in development, although it's 1.5 years already. But yeah, I want to add more stuff, more rules, maybe merging several regions into one region so it doesn't look so even, like you have the area of each region is very even right now. Of course, more props and more things that like rocks and things that can exist in the world or in Finland. More towns that can be like connected with cables or something. Yeah, of course, lakes that are not just regions filled with water, but actually have some better shape and stuff like that. So what about mountains? And this is one of the things that maybe for another thing that you can make, like if you raise the end point of the road, right, it creates these hairpins automatically, which is just something that I kind of experimented on. So if the game ever gets an update that's not just Finland, I'm probably going to use something like this. One more thing that I was experimenting with is terrain deformation, but I'm not going to go into it because it's very early. But it kind of works in a similar way to the shadow, where I just have like a top-down camera, and yeah, it's very common to what other people use as well. But implementing this in an infinite world is a challenge, so yeah, that's something I need to work on. So yeah, modding you can modify parameters, and yeah, that's and you can share all these. Each set of parameters, you can just copy it, send to someone else, and they will see the exact same world, which is really cool. And you could add custom textures, models. Somebody could even make like a actually high-res game instead of this. So yeah, I think that modders should be able to configure everything in game, because like especially being a solo developer, that's I think that. Like having a modding community is incredibly important. Yeah, the only thing that I'm not probably going to have in the game is 3D modeling. So like you import a model if you want of props of cars and stuff. So one more thing, like for maybe future, is I was working on this road builder, which basically uses the same thing, but you can design new custom roads that don't use the generator in game. So the point is to have all the tools in game and not use some external tools, which I think is a pretty cool thing that players will like. So yeah, I didn't click on these, but these are the points that I just explained. So yeah, the challenges is that there's a lot of frame time taken by physics. So, you know, I need to do world generation at the same time, which is a challenge, right? So everything is moving, no static objects, no occlusion culling that I can use from Unity, so I either need to invent it myself or implement some other thing. And static mesh collider generation takes a long time in Unity, and you can't offload it from the main thread, which is a big challenge. But then you can always make smaller objects to avoid like lags. But the more objects you have, the more shifting will cost, so it's like a compromise. And being a solo developer kind of sucks, because you can spend one day on one thing, and this procedurally generated world is just like 25% of the game. There's also physics and everything that a game needs, right? And there's rabbit holes everywhere that you can just fall into, like time? Okay, sorry. Yeah, it's like you can always like start reading these papers and you know, just spend so much time trying to implement something and it doesn't work for your use case, especially because like for my use case of like creating endless worlds, like 90% of procedural generation stuff doesn't really work. Yeah, there's some new exciting Unity features like the dot stack, which I can use, and I'm just going to kind of skip through this because it's a long story. Okay, and you can talk to me about that if you want afterwards. So yeah, one of the things is that they kind of say that it's amazing, which is true for some things, but also scheduling takes time. This is maybe the most important point, so I'll just talk about this. So like if you want to run physics at like 1000 hertz, then even scheduling jobs takes a lot of time, and plain C# scripts are actually faster, so which is really weird. Anyway, yeah, so meshes don't support native arrays yet, which I'm probably going to, okay, yeah, so the good stuff is it's really fast, it's really cool, blah, blah, blah. Yes, so the ending, the pro tips from me. If you don't need to make something endless, maybe don't, because I could probably make the game in 2 months if I didn't do it. All these challenges of like moving, scheduling stuff, so yeah, it took a lot longer, less performance because nothing is static, but it's a good challenge. It's kind of like that that talk we had about the flow graph, right? It's kind of like, oh, I find this really challenging, right? So I'm really excited to work on something like this because nobody has made like an endless racing game, or at least I think so, like this at least. And yeah, try to recognize rabbit holes and not dive too much into them. A lot of times, like the stupidest, simplest things are enough. And yeah, it's 2019, think in a more data-oriented way, because anyway, you're just moving data around. You're not, you should not think about objects too much. And the paradox of mastering, which I call, which is something that if people tell me like, oh, why don't you use this tool? Why don't you use that tool? And I'm really skilled by now in Unity. I can really make stuff really fast. But the problem is like I'm too attached to Unity. So like I need to hack it, or I need to you know, wait for stuff to happen from them to make things faster, which is good that they're doing it now. But you know, if I just touched a few tools, then I would not master anything. So that's the paradox of mastering. And that's it. Yeah. So just Google this Notke, and you can find me. And so you should join INFINLAND Discord, I think. I made a QR code. I've never ever seen anyone read a QR code before. Oh, This is my first time, and if you're trying to, great. I just think it's like a bullshit thing, but yeah, I just made it because you have this link, right? And it's like this crazy code that, so yeah, I had to make a QR code for Discord. Okay, that's it. Sorry.